Buckets on, folks! It's time to talk about the unsung heroes of the Star Wars universe. Beyond lightsabers and spaceships, let's take a look at what keeps the brain cases safe in a galaxy far, far away. Life is hard in the Star Wars galaxy, so you better get a helmet. Fortunately, the galaxy of Star Wars has some pretty sweet helmets. From Mandalorians to Stormtroopers to rogue squadrons, headgear in Star Wars can spark the imagination and inspire legions. What's behind the helmets, and what's their on-screen and off-screen story? Let's take a look at what's keeping people's heads straight down Star Wars' way. Sometime around 900 BCE, some Assyrians realized that getting hit in the head was unpleasant and came up with the idea of putting something solid between the things coming for their head and their head. And the helmet was born. Dun-dun-dun-dun. Since that time, the helmet has evolved from something that would protect people's noggins from injuries, ranging from swinging weapons to bicycle falls and poorly aimed baseballs. Since the Assyrians decided less head injuries was the best way to win battles, helmets have combined function and form, and in some cases, have made some bold statements. While we don't have the same kind of archaeological evidence of the evolution of protective headgear in a galaxy far, far away, we do have a lot of work developing that world and so much world to develop. What was a couple lines of dialogue about a war long fought became the movie and long-running animated series The Clone Wars. Star Wars had the ability to create a lived-in world by what it didn't explain as much as it did. Perhaps the biggest example of that is the character who had all of 4 lines of dialogue, but became a huge fan favorite. We're of course talking about Boba Fett, the bounty hunter in Mandalorian Armor. Is Boba Fett a Mandalorian? That's a fight that has reached out to the geekosphere all the way to Time magazine. But that's the power of the world building in the Star Wars universe. One thing that's not in dispute is how cool the Mandalorian armor is. And there's enough material that exists about the Mandalorian and their sweet helmets that we can treat them as the Assyrians of the Star Wars universe. There is no other group that has appeared in a Star Wars movie, series, or novel that has taken their helmets more seriously. For the Mandalorians, the helmet has moved past a thing to wear to protect their brain bone, but as a part of their very identity. In the Disney Plus series, it's so much of the Mandalorian's identity that they're not allowed to even take it off. Is that Pedro Pascal under there? I don't know. The importance of the helmet in the Mandalorian culture is no accident. Mandalorians are not a race, but instead a culture. Anyone who abides by the rules and codes of the Mandalorians and proves they can handle themselves gets to be a Mandalorian. Somewhere that fight over Boba Fett being a Mandalorian or not has raged even hotter. According to the extended universe, the brain bucket got its start with the Mandalorians, with who else? Mandalore the First. Gotta start somewhere, right? That was a couple of epochs ago, Star Wars years, before the Battle of Yemen, when a plucky group of rebels used a fleet of starfighters and super mind powers blew up the Empire's super weapon. Once you get into the epic leading up to the rebels popping some torpedoes down the Death Star's exhaust ports, the armor had gone through a number of changes. Some of that involved Fett, this time Cassis. Cassis had the ear of Mandalore the Ultimate. Mandalorian leaders were not known for their humility. Mandalore the Ultimate, or Ulti, as I like to call him, is the Mandalorian that start to let anyone get in on the Mandalorian thing as long as they followed the code. During the Mandalorian Wars, Cassis convinced old Ulti during the Mandalorian Wars that they should adopt a more uniform set of armor, setting on the Neo Crusader armor. The final change comes after a time when the Mandalorians were scattered and then reunited under, who else, Mandalore the Uniter. Her big contribution was to make the armor more modular, lighter, and sleeker. All of this would be a footnote were it not for a mercenary who was looking for a rather odd payday. That mercenary was named Jango Fett, and the weird payday was a tissue donor so that Count Dooku, Darth Tyrannus if you're nasty, could have a clone army built in secret. A secret that was blown when Jango was unable to kill Padme and Obi Wan Kenobi, and was able to track him to Kamino where he was living with the millions of programmed clones, and just one for him that would grow up to be Boba Fett. Jango offered more than just some tissue for a bunch of hymns. His Mandalorian armor also influenced the final look of the Clone Warrior armor. After all, they were clones of him. The clone armor had to be mass-produced because, well, the clones themselves were mass-produced, instead of the cool alloys that the Mandalorians use called Beskar. Clone Troopers' armor was made of plastoid that would protect against a variety of threats, except the one they faced the most, blaster fire. But at least it could survive heat and acrid vapors. The biggest visual clues of the influence of Jango on his millions of copies, other than them all being exact replicas of him, I mean, a million soldiers with the same face is a pretty big visual clue, is the T-shaped visor that adorned the Clone Trooper helmets. This one fashion cue connects the otherwise reclusive and do-your-own-thing Mandalorians, and the more rigid and ubiquitous warrior class. After the order was given to execute the Jedi, the Empire did away with the clones, instead going for natural-born soldiers. Retired and rogue clone warriors would continue to use their old clone trooper armor, which would go on to influence a whole new set of armor a little later. But first we have to get to the helmets we all know the best. It's those Stormtrooper helmets. Before we get into Stormtrooper helmets, we have to address the elephant in the room regarding all of this history. History, especially in a fictional universe, can be what you want it to be, just like the events you're writing at the moment. That too can be what you want it to be. It's all made up. Even worse, what made up part is real or matters, and what made up part isn't and doesn't is up to whoever holds the rights to those characters. So when George Lucas took his $4 billion with a B home to work on other things that were important to him, Disney promptly announced that the extended universe was no longer part of the official canon. That means that most of the Mandalorian history wiped out, didn't happen. In its place has been sort of a Frankenstein's monster of the best little bits that might make the details wrong, but the overall conceit is the same, such as the strength of suggestion through the Star Wars series. If all of that seems arbitrary, that's not even the half of it. Chronologically in our time, the Stormtrooper armor of the original trilogy was the first set of helmets made, and they were made in a time that might as well be defined as before Star Wars. Before Star Wars, the state of science fiction was relatively dry, with one central effect, usually involving shrinking or growing really big, or making little things big and big things seem small. Swashbuckling adventure was reserved for low-budget serialized shows like Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, both played by Buster Crabbe. The idea that science fiction could be for adults or taken seriously was a novel concept that not everyone was on board with. This means that much of what Lucas and his team of special effects artists and the newly formed Industrial Light and Magic were creating everything from whole cloth, both combining old special effects techniques and creating all new ones. That's especially true when it comes to the helmets worn by the ubiquitous Stormtroopers. George Lucas needed to suit up a bunch of the Imperial strongmen and needed a distinct look for them. The design he chose was a sculpture by a man named Nick Pemberton. The only problem was turning that design into 50 helmets in such a short period of time. Fortunately, a few doors down from Pemberton's shop was another man named Andrew Ainsworth, who had a technique to make things with plastic molds like kayaks and swimming pools. Up to that point, the team had been making things out of plaster and other materials, but Ainsworth was able to turn a sculpture into a helmet in 2 days. The problem with doing anything fast is that everyone will want even more faster. Lucas needed 50 of those helmets, plus other pieces, to make up his world, and he needed them fast because they were headed into shooting. With a small budget and not a lot of confidence from studios that there was a market for something like Star Wars, they were in a bind. Ainsworth did the impossible and gave Lucas all 3, producing helmets at just $30 a head. The catch was that not every uniform helmet was exactly uniform. This became especially true over the course of the series as more helmets had to be made. And here once again the lived-in feel of the Star Wars universe comes into play, because a simple reality of film production had become part of the canon, with the slight variations of the helmet becoming an indicator of various divisions and origins of troops, down to what the frown size means, even though it means that a person was inventing the technique to mass-produce the helmets in his workshop under a tight budget and deadline. Just like the Mandalorian commando armor suggested by Cassius Fett, the Stormtrooper armor was meant, despite production variations, to be relatively uniform, and present a seemingly endless supply of shock troops ready and willing to enforce the will of the newly formed Empire. As such, each helmet was equipped with an array of filters and sensors to make them adaptable to any scenario the Empire might send troops into. Just to make sure we all understand just how oppressive the Empire was, since the only way to communicate through the helmet was with the comms that were installed in them, everything a Stormtrooper said was recorded. Can't have one of your Stormtroopers become horrified at the destruction of an innocent village and defecting with your captured X-Wing pilot after all. Well, more on that later. While the helmets were universally adaptable, there were some conditions where they needed a bit of a boost. The most obvious example is when the rebellion decided to hide out in the coldest place they could find, thinking no one would find them there. Surprise! In this case, a cover was added to the helmet to recirculate heat and keep the helmet functioning and the trooper inside capable of withstanding that kind of cold. This cover, called the breather hood, recycled heat from the Stormtroopers themselves, as well as prevented frost from covering the shield or hindering the onboard electronics. That's right, the Stormtroopers had a heads-up display that helped them identify targets, including motion and heat sensors, and even a sensor that separated friend from foe. Why none of that worked when our heroes were facing a legion of troopers is a question that has plagued fans for decades, and made Obi Wan insisting that only Stormtroopers are this accurate seems like an odd thing to say. Maybe he was just remembering when they were clones. Most of the other troops were variations on the theme, with the biggest difference being color to indicate their positions, such as the red-clad Royal Guards. The only troops that got a significantly different helmet were the Scout troops, whose visors were larger to accommodate their double duty as snipers. Their armor was lighter to allow for more maneuverability, both on and off speeder bikes that they used exclusively. Their face masks could also be raised to allow their face to be revealed when needed for taking long-distance shots. It's not just the Galactic Empire that likes to protect their heads. Rebel troops wore helmets closer to what soldiers in our world would wear, covering the top of their head with a visor that could lower. They also contain the communication equipment needed to keep the troops organized, making them a little wide and bulky. Where the real excitement lies is, like always, in the fighter pilots. Pemberton and Ainsworth fashioned the helmets off the real-world APH-6B fighter pilot helmets, but sporting a stylish rib down the center like a mohawk haircut. Just like the Stormtrooper helmet, a real-world production consideration worked its way into a movie story element that helped give Star Wars that lived-in feel. Pilots in the military have been known to customize their own helmets over time, to make their buckets their own, and that tradition continued into Star Wars, both of fleshing out the world and a way to make use of the same helmet several times without it looking like that's exactly what they're doing. Some of those designs became ways to identify some fringe but key players, like everyone's favorite pilot in the series, Wedge Antilles, and his plain green helmet. Checkerboards, racing stripes, and even Poe Dameron's simple design became quick ways to recognize the characters during the dogfights, and just like their real-world counterparts, gave us a glimpse into who they are and who they might be when they're not fighting people trying to take over the galaxy. The big star, of course, is the breathing apparatus turned ominous sign of doom that is Darth Vader's helmet. By now we all know why Darth Vader needed that helmet, and all the events that led up to it, including his former master telling Vader that the master had the high ground, always with the high ground. Just like with everything, there were non-story reasons for things to be done. The triangular mouthpiece had to be widened to go over actor David Prowse's chin. The mask was so largely tinted acrylic to give better visibility, especially to stunt performers who would do most of Vader's more high-risk maneuvers. In the world of Star Wars, the helmet is very uncomfortable, pinning needles in Vader's skull so that he could control all his robotic limbs he got when someone had the high ground and used it. The suit itself feeds him both nutrients and air with a feeding tube that takes care of any food needs while he's not in the helmet. Up until his death, spoilers, but also come on, we had only seen the back of his head as he went into the chamber to recuperate. The best function of the Darth Vader helmet, of course, is to take a kind of unremarkable and high voice and turn it into James Earl Jones. Who doesn't want to sound like James Earl Jones? One person who definitely wanted to sound like James Earl Jones was Kylo Ren, otherwise known as Ben Solo, the son of Han Solo and Leia Organa. Obviously, as a Skywalker, Ben was strong in the Force. Also, because Ben was a Skywalker, he had some complicated relationships with both his dad and his mentors. First, he scared his uncle into a point of weakness, then flipped out and ran away, where he formed another troubled relationship with Snoke. Not just father figures, but his own father, who he killed in the hopes that he would become a true Dark Master of the Force and totally show those guys. Oh yeah, he'd show everybody. Kylo Ren was totally the guy who was gonna show everybody. Unlike his grandfather's mask, Kylo didn't need his. He just thought it looked super cool. No sooner had Kylo's helmet been introduced as shortly into the second movie, as Kylo smashed his helmet because Snoke made him feel bad. Apparently, shady masterminds need to do a little negging on their apprentices to make sure they don't get any ideas. Of course, that's a terrible practice, and might result in a self-righteously emboldened apprentice to just jump to the head of the class. When given the ultimatum to kill Brie Larson, Kylo says nah and cuts Snoke in half instead. Just keep that in mind the next time you want to say something negative to someone in a manipulative way. You never know when today is punching day. Also, just, don't be a jerk. When J.J. Abrams returned to finish out the series, the helmet returned, as well as a hint of Japanese history called kintsugi. The idea is to break a vase and then glue it together with colored glue to make the fracture part of the design. When it came time to resurrect the Stormtrooper, design elements were taken from both the original story and the prequels. The result is a sleeker and more lighter helmet, with some but not all of the functionality of the Stormtrooper helmets. This means that some but not all of the visual enhancements, including targeting, are not included, but let's face it, most troopers were turning that part off first, weren't you? The filtration system is there, but not as strong. The First Order had to make the armor in secret after the last remnants of the Empire had signed an agreement not to after the second Death Star was blown up. Of course, they were going to break that deal. They're the Empire after all. And that's a breakdown of the helmets in Star Wars. Which one's your favorite? Is it the one that makes you sound like James Earl Jones? It's always the one that makes you sound like James Earl Jones. Let us know in the comments, and while you're there, be sure to subscribe to CBR for the latest videos straight to your inbox. Thanks for watching.